Thank you for coming. I'm Mark Crispin Miller. This is McNally Jackson's first Tuesday series. Generally, we deal with political titles, and we prefer books that either get unfairly ignored by the mainstream press or unfairly attacked. I don't wish that on any of our authors. That's just the kind of forum we try to provide. I'm really thrilled to see such a big turnout here tonight because our speaker is a good friend of mine, someone who came not long ago to talk about his previous book, Daybreak, and that's David Swanson, who is an intrepid, tireless activist, and just as intrepid and tireless a writer. He's as fast as he is eloquent, which is really saying something. His new book is War is a Lie. He's not only the author, but he's the publisher of this book, which has been described as the most comprehensive anti-war statement in the English language. It's a book that we need, especially now that the war-making machine is sort of puffing away on all gears, and we don't hear the kinds of arguments that David makes often enough. So what we're going to do is we're going to have David speak informally for 15 minutes or so, and then he'll take your questions. You ought to consider buying the book if you haven't already, because he is an independent author, an independent publisher, and this is an independent bookstore. So if people don't buy these books, we're all basically screwed, okay? So I urge you to buy them. And if through some happy chance, which seems quite likely, all the copies here have been sold already, David will sign yours, okay, when we're done. And you can also go to warisalie.org and buy them in bulk. And if you do, you get a big discount, and they send free copies to peace groups, and it'll make you feel so proud of yourselves morally, which is a treat in addition to the book itself. So please join me in welcoming my good friend David Swanson.
That is wonderful to have such an introduction from Mark Crispin Miller, who is an author I have admired for a long time. Thank you very much to McNally Jackson Bookstore and to Mark for setting this up. And I was on the phone recently with a group of people in Afghanistan, and some Americans were over there who are coming back here to New York City, and I wanted to be sure to mention and not forget Kathy Kelly. How many of you know who Kathy Kelly is? Wonderful peace activist from the United States, was going to be here with us tonight, but missed a flight, or a flight was canceled or something. But she and Mike Ferner, who heads up Veterans for Peace, which headed up a protest at the White House on December 16th, where veterans and others advocated the position of 2/3 of the American public against the war in Afghanistan and were arrested for it, and those charges were dropped today. Mike Ferner and Eric Stoner, a New Yorker, and Kathy are going to be here at the Unitarian Church at 1157 Lexington and 80th Street on Friday the 7th at 7. So show up for that. And I can't help but mention at least a fraction of the wonderful people who are here. Independent filmmaker and author Danny Schechter, raise your hand. Head of one of our best activist groups, World Can't Wait, Deborah Sweet, I spot over there. Author of one of the best works of fiction I know of against this war machine, that is of drama, of a play called Prophecy, among others, is here in the front. Karen Malpede, raise your hand. And her husband, George, who can't raise his hand because he's shooting video for us, who is a wonderful actor in these plays. And I guess I could keep going with the whole audience just about, but it's great to be in New York. I was at Grit TV with Laura Flanders today, which is another great media outlet if you don't know about it. And then I was over at the United Nations doing an interview with United Nations TV, which I didn't know much about before being there. And they were asking me all about the United Nations and war. And the United Nations, of course, was started in opposition to war. And it was an interesting interview and conversation, to be there where I had to go through the whole airport-like insecurity nonsense to get in there. And they let the United States government have this giant building right across the street from which they spy illegally on all of the diplomats there at the United Nations, not to mention falsely claiming UN authorization for wars the UN has explicitly refused to authorize, and so forth. It's incredible to me the number of Americans who are pleading to be kept ignorant right now. Don't tell us what's happening. Arrest as a traitor anyone who tells us what our government is doing. Right? I'm not just talking about Congressman Peter King, who says it would be better to be bombed than to let WikiLeaks expose this information, which tells you how irrational and what these people fear. But I'm talking about perhaps a majority of Americans who would prefer to be kept in the dark about what the government is doing than to be told by someone other than the government, an act of journalism, which has been equated with treason at this point. I'm encouraged by the public's viewpoint on a lot of things, including on wars. We had a majority willing to go into Iraq. We had a majority willing to go into Afghanistan. Now we have a majority that says we never should have. And we have a majority that has refused to get behind a war in Iran, a war in North Korea, and so forth. And yet, we still have that potential. We still have that idea that there could be a war we should get behind. We also have a majority strongly in favor of cutting money out of the military, but not a real ability to make it happen yet. I think the reason I wrote this book called War is Alive was to get past this point where we sort of decide years after the fact that a war was a bad idea, where we know immediately as a new war is pitched, or as a war that's underway that hasn't been acknowledged, like our war in Pakistan, is exposed, that we immediately say no, we won't stand for it. I mean, we don't talk about good rape and bad rape, or just slavery and unjust slavery, and yet we talk about war as something that can be good or bad, depending on the circumstances. We don't understand it as a crime, which is what it has been since 1928 in this country, and what it's been under the UN Charter since 1945, and yet we've completely lost that understanding that war is a crime, and that war is the most immoral act possible. Any alternative at all is always preferable. We've lost that understanding, and it's interesting that at the UN that the European Union has done as much, I think, for getting rid of war as the UN. It's inconceivable that two nations in Europe would go to war, or that two states within the United States would go to war. But the UN has not become that international unifying power. And of course we could support it and enlarge it and make it that. It would need to be democratized within. But it hasn't got there. And so I've been thinking about this topic of getting rid of war, which I take up in chapter 4 of the book, after addressing some of the main lies that are used war after war to start these wars. I've had some very smart people tell me they were offended by the war on Iraq because it was the first time in history that a president had lied about war. And I looked back at every war this country has started and continued and lied about after the fact. And I looked at wars that other countries have started for the past few millennia, and I just can't find one that's any different. It's the Iraq War is absolutely typical. There's a sort of a superficial difference in that the primary lie was a very simple yes or no question that could very easily be disproved, and was. But the whole package of lies was absolutely typical. And so this question of whether we have to have wars or can get rid of them, once you expose all the typical patterns of lies, all the reasons that are on the front page over and over again for why we have to have the wars, and then once you look at the real reasons that are usually not secret at all, they're just not on the front page, they're on page 15 once and then forgotten about, and then all the irrational drives that are still necessary to explain the wars because the rational motives don't do it, you realize that wars could be stopped. That, in fact, there's not some force of overpopulation or our genes or our prehistory, our evolution, our culture that makes wars inevitable. That, in fact, most human societies have not known war. Many human societies have limited war, have eliminated war. We have societies that have led the way to war and then dropped war and opposed it. We have whole regions and continents that have not known war until other cultures came. Australia didn't have war. Parts of the southwest of this country didn't have war. And so you have to take a new look at the contemporary scene and history and prehistory. So we stop looking at ancient bones of Australopithecine and finding war wounds where there's really tooth wounds of the cats that ate us. You have to stop looking at the walls of Jericho that were built for floods and pretending they were built for wars, because we impose war on everybody. And come to an understanding that we have a choice here. That in fact, if other nations weren't pushing war just because they can't, just because of a Pax Americana, just because they don't need to or they can't win them, then they would be gung-ho about joining our coalitions of the willing. And they just aren't. They have to be bribed and pulled, kicking and screaming. They don't want wars. As, of course, most Americans don't, in general, want wars. And when they learn enough about a particular war, most Americans oppose that war. I do want to be brief and do questions because I am too long-winded answering questions, but I want to mention a couple of things about my previous book because of what's happening right now in Washington. Because once we get to that place where 80-90% of us understand that there can be no good war, we come face up against the problem that we don't have any control whatsoever over our government in Washington, D.C. And my previous book, I sort of did this backwards. My previous book was about the sorts of reforms needed to try to get some control over our government in Washington. And one of the things that I objected to strongly, and that presidential candidate Obama at the time objected to strongly, was a thing called a signing statement. And for the past couple of days, more than ever, progressives and liberals and Democrats have been clamoring for President Obama to write a signing statement. And a signing statement, could be just, I just signed this bill and it was sunny today and I love you. But under George W. Bush, it became, I just signed this bill and here are the parts I'm going to violate, which offended everybody to the left of Karl Rove. And now we want it. And the problem with that, people want it because they want Obama to sign a quote-unquote defense authorization bill and put in there, I object and will not comply with the bit about I can't put Guantanamo detainees on trial in real courts. Right? Not that he's going to actually do it, but that he wants to have the power in order, in the words of a White House spokesperson, to be able to pretend you're closing Guantanamo. His words. And so now people want the signing state. And the problem with this is that when you give presidents the power to eliminate laws, when you take the power away from Congress to make laws, presidents will have absolute power regardless of whether they're on your team or the evil team. This will be all future presidents now, because you've had 2 consecutive presidents of opposing parties, as they call them, engage in this practice. This is far, far more dangerous than Guantanamo, right? As is the proposal for a new authorization to use military force that would go beyond the one from 2001, which we routinely violate anyway, but would take out the part about there needs to be a connection to 9/11 and just say presidents can make wars. Right? This is something the new Republican House wants to do, regardless of who's president at the moment. And then the other thing is a thing called the filibuster, which, we all think is this wonderful grassroots democratic mechanism because of a film that a war propagandist made 70 years ago with Jimmy Stewart in it. And the fact is that giving long speeches, I don't care if you're Jimmy Stewart or Strom Thurmond or Bernie Sanders, is not a filibuster. It's just giving long speeches. A filibuster is blocking a bill with a minority of people signed up to block a bill, which is minority rule, even within that incredibly disproportionate gang of 100 wealthy, rich, old white guys that we call the Senate. And we now have people on the left side of the political spectrum saying, oh, God, no, don't take away minority rule in the Senate because the Democrats might need it. So I'm urging that we think a little more long-term and a little less partisanly about how we can get control of this government, because to the extent, until we can get rid of the Senate, to the extent that the Senate can stop the House, and to the extent that the President can ignore both of them, we are disempowered. Our only chance is reforming the Congress to the point where we have some say over it. And we actually have a golden opportunity right now. Today, the Secretary of War, which since 1947 we have very misleadingly called the Secretary of Defense, is talking about cutting $100 billion out of defense. Now, I'm not clear what. I'm not clear if that's in 1 year or 20. I'm not clear if that's just the Department of Defense or other departments included. But this is on the table in Washington, being pushed by the President's Cat Food Commission, being pushed from the Institute for Policy Studies and from Cato Institute and all sides. And we have an opportunity here to make a real break in the most effective propaganda campaign of the past few decades. The campaign that has said, government is evil, defund government, government's against you, except for the military, give it everything. We have an opportunity finally to say, hey, the military costs money. It costs more than half of every dollar you pay in taxes. And it damages our safety and our economy and the environment and our government, and everybody wants it cut. What about our so-called representatives? So to the extent that I would urge any immediate actions other than, of course, buying books, I would say call your misrepresentatives and tell them that we want that money cut, that we want the filibuster ended, not mended, and we don't want presidents rewriting laws with signing statements. And I'll be glad to take your questions. We have one microphone and it's here, so if you could speak up, that would be wonderful, and I'll try to repeat your question if people miss it. In the second row here. And then
the top-selling video game presently, by far, is Modern Warfare Call of Duty. You're familiar with this? Could you
Yes.
please talk about that?
It's a Cold War game.
Well, the question is whether I'm familiar with the top-selling war video game in this country, which is, of course, a war game that, like other war games, is produced in cooperation with the United States military. And how many of you are familiar with the percentage of U.S. soldiers in World War II who shot their weapons at the enemy? Anybody have a number?
Read your book.
20.
Oh, okay. I read my book. 20% of the participants of the Greatest Generation's crusade against the greatest evil that it wasn't actually against actually did more than the people who stayed home and grew tomatoes. And the reason was that they weren't trained in the very way that these video games are training our kids. They weren't trained to kill human beings. They didn't shoot human-like targets. They shot bullseyes with circles. They didn't stab human dummies. They weren't drilled and conditioned the way that our soldiers are now, so that over 90% of them, when under pressure, without thought, do what they've been conditioned to do. They have not been conditioned to live after the fact with having done it, which is why we have this incredible epidemic of trauma and suicide. But they are trained very, very well to do it. And arguably, our children are being trained better than were any soldiers up through the middle of the last century. Up through the middle of the last century, we didn't have wars to compare with the wars we have now in terms of weaponry, in terms of damage, in terms of death. I mean, old wars were closer to wrestling matches than to our current state of war. But when we had wars, a great many people did not actually participate because most people, 98% of people, according to some studies, are just very, very resistant without heavy conditioning to kill other human beings. When we started bombing cities, I should say, when in Europe, when Britain and then Germany started bombing cities, and after Japan had been bombing cities, the expectation was that you would just have hordes of traumatized zombies wandering out of the ruins who just couldn't survive it mentally. And you didn't. You didn't. I mean, people were not thrilled, but they were not insane either. And it's because they hadn't been asked to kill human beings. And they hadn't gone face to face with human beings pointing guns at them, personally, specifically trying to kill them. Those are the two things that destroy soldiers. They had just been bombed, which is horrific, but it's not the same. And the conditioning that you need to do those things is the conditioning that's in the video games. I think, yeah.
It's conceivable to me that the Civil War could have been fought through negotiation and communication. But are you suggesting that World War II, a war built on such heinous ideology, could have been won through negotiation?
Well, I think of slavery as the question is, the Civil War could have been negotiated away, but could World War II, given the heinous ideology of the opponents, have been avoided? And, I think of slavery as a pretty heinous ideology.
Well,
I'm sure that you do as well. And of course, again, back to getting rid of the Senate. The House could have resolved the matter of slavery without war or division. We could have allowed division without war. Slavery would not have lasted long. But when you come to World War II, of course, there are millions of ways that it could have been avoided. But I think it's interesting that the reason we think it couldn't have been is the bizarre sort of evil of the enemy. And I imagine you're thinking of the European as opposed to the Japanese enemy in this case, because we imagine World War II in retrospect as having been fought against the concentration camps and the genocide just as we imagine in retrospect the Civil War having been begun to end slavery, when of course it wasn't. And of all the World War II posters, you can't find any that say, I want you to save the Jews. You can't find any mention of it. In fact, the president blocked bills for years that would have let Jewish refugee children into the country, shut down any possibility of helping, turned ships away, avoided the issue entirely. It was neither a real motive for the war nor propaganda for the war. It was neither. It's just propaganda for the war after the fact. That being said, Germany and Japan were both imperialistic, expansionist governments that were interested in launching wars. So was this one. And the further you go back, the easier it is to explain how easily you could have avoided World War II, right? We could have not ended World War I by punishing an entire people rather than its rulers. We could have not invested Wall Street money in the Nazis for decades. We could have taken steps for decades to improve what was happening in Europe and in Japan. And in terms of international relations, we could have supported the League of Nations. You know, but you get up to that moment, right? We're trained to think only in terms of that split second before we start a campaign to kill 70 million people to save 6 million people that we didn't save, and we think this is where we have to decide, do we do it or not? And we laugh at Gandhi, and we refused to give him a Peace Prize because we saved that for the real heroes, because he said we should use that the Germans and the British should use nonviolence, but he also said thousands would have to die, and instead we killed 70 million. And the idea that delay, that waiting a day, waiting a week, waiting a month, trying to find a way to negotiate was the real enemy, that we had to rush into war before we could think about it any longer was the only moral thing to do, just doesn't stand up against the fact that you can't imagine anything worse than the course we took that killed 70 million people. But that being said, you can go back 70 years to World War II and say, aha, there can be good wars, and provide not a shred of support for keeping the current war machine alive. You're talking about a world that was not dominated by the United States. Here we are in a completely different universe where the United States has sliced the globe up into Northern Command, Southern Command, Central Command. We have bases on every continent. We've got 1,000 bases, 500,000 troops. Everybody's got U.S. troops on their doorstep. We dominate the place, not to mention outer space. And to go back 70 years to a completely different world and say, well, I really like that war, does absolutely nothing to justify bankrupting our economy, our representative government, our environment, spreading blowback and nuclear proliferation, and destroying our souls to keep this thing going. It just is not relevant, in my view. Yes?
Given democracy and the way in which people vote, the various things that you're saying is kind of preaching to the choir. What methodology can you use, given that you have to elect congressmen, blue-collar people who don't think the way you and I do? What method can you use within democracy to change the situation that you're referring to?
God, just electing a blue-collar congressman, I think, would be a wonderful development. If you know of any, please put me in touch. The fact is that unless...
One is the senator from Boston.
The senator from Boston.
One.
Well, you know, if you pose naked, I guess you can get in there.
I hear you're dodging the issue.
Well,
I'm saying you can't make democracy work by brainwashing people to vote in a good way and not vote their best interest. People vote their prejudice over their pocket. If they would be intelligent, they would vote out the Republicans, but in their financial best interest. However, they vote their prejudice. Now, given that, how do you change this situation?
well, most people...
say something about that?
If you let me answer this, yeah.
Okay. Well, no. Your premise is incorrect. Okay, because there is every evidence that both Bush regimes were not elected by the people of this country, and there is also evidence that Scott Brown wasn't elected. Okay, we have a completely corrupt voting system that is the plaything primarily, although not only of the Republicans. So you cannot take the official results of any elections over the last 10 years and base an argument about what the people really want and how they vote on it. That's just as a point of information. It's not the subject of tonight's talk, but it's important that more people support David's position than we would think from the results of our elections in this decade.
Well, it is the subject of some great books written and edited by this guy, including Loser Take All, I think, is the one you should start with. But I think that setting aside whether our votes are accurately counted, and I completely agree with Mark on this one, both Americans and that other 95% of humanity that we sort of brush aside a lot of times have very often voted very intelligently, and education has made a tremendous amount of difference in that. And when we got into both world wars and the Vietnam War and most of the wars that we've been involved in, people voted for candidates who said they would keep them out of the wars. People voted for candidates who said they would end the wars. Or, as in 2006, people voted in the Democrats, their primary reason in every exit poll, so that they would end the war in Iraq. Of course, the Democrats, for the most part, hadn't promised to do that, and they proceeded to escalate it, and then proceeded to escalate the war in Afghanistan after we voted them in one more time. So, when after 4 years of that, when people give up and stay home, which is what happened, they didn't change and say, "Oh, I'll try the Republicans." No, they stayed home. It's not so terribly shocking. It's not forgivable. It's not the right choice, but it's also not the biggest part of what people have to do in a representative republic, which in large part involves making their demands clear in between elections as well as on that one day. But if you're going to give up on the possibility of educating your fellow citizens to a wiser view of the world than you think they have, then you're giving up on democracy and you're hoping for a benevolent dictator, or you're just ready for doomsday. And it's these people who are currently saying, "Oh, let's keep minority rule in the Senate. Let's have presidents rewrite laws," that I think are hoping for a benevolent dictator in the face of not having one, and knowing full well that they're sooner or later, probably within 2 years, going to have someone they think of as the exact opposite of that. Yes?
Yeah, when I came back from Vietnam, I racked my brain trying to figure out why I went to Vietnam. And someone challenged me and said, "You'll never figure this out unless you understand what imperialism is." And in doing that, I tried to get more scientific and more materialist about this system that we live under, and went back and studied U.S. history and also all the wars, certainly since the 1800s, and the whole role of the U.S. military, for the past 200 years. And the question is, when you referred to Britain and Germany as imperialist powers, you didn't actually call this country an imperialist power for the past, since the 1800s. And my question is, if you're going to, uproot something and oppose something, shouldn't you be trying to understand what the root of it is? Isn't the root of it in the property relations in this capitalist system that actually needs war and expansion in order to stay alive? And the question then becomes, isn't that the source of war?
Well, I do have a book that calls this country an imperialist power since before this country was a country, and points to the defeat of Britain in the U.S. War of Independence as very bad news for Native Americans, because Britain had been preventing expansion westward. I mean, the very act of birth of this country was an act of expansionist empire. It's in our bones. It's been there ever since. It's been justified as the will of God and everything else. And it's something that Americans have a very hard time seeing the way the rest of the world sees it. Our exceptionalism comes straight out of that. This idea that we have to stay in Afghanistan for the good of the Afghans, whether they like it or not, knowing full well that we would never stand for that in our own country, occupied by someone else, comes straight out of that. But when you say, isn't that the root of war, isn't that the reason for war, I have to disagree, because before the evening's through, if this event is like others, 6 other people will explain the single reason for war, and it'll be something else, and they'll be just as right as you are, because there isn't a single reason for wars. I mean, these wars have electoral motivations among politicians, they have profit motives, they have motives of power and domination and insecurity of the emotions of these people that are just irrational, as well as being driven by, strategic calculations of where the bases should go and the desire to test new weaponry and so forth. There's always a whole package of real reasons, and a lot of them are part of building an empire. But I don't think that's all there is to it, that simply, or that encompasses all of the reasons for war. But I'm 1,000% in favor of talking about it as much as possible, and I do in the book.
Hi.
Yes.
I'm sorry I missed your talk. I had a quiet happiness, but I've read a little online. I wondered if you've assessed what the effects are of our empire that's now at war, regarding, does it help certain corporations? Does it help a certain class of investors? Does it help American workers? Has that been assessed? And if so, what would be, in other words, what is the effect that we're surrounding China? Does that keep China more away from the idea that they're going to demand payment now? I mean, does it have any effect at all, the empire, except for the good of the generals and the people selling the war equipment? What effect does it have?
I don't know. As Mark says, that's a rhetorical question. If you heard the question, it is what beneficial effect on anybody or our workers or our society or our foreign relations does this war making have? And very, very little. In fact, what we're doing militarily, imperialistically, is destroying our economy. It's enriching certain people and certain corporations in the short run, and more than ever, the military has been privatized, the reconstruction industry has been developed, those profits have been freed to buy elections with no limits. But overall, it is destroying the economy. I mean, Wall Street is famously known in recent years and at other times for destroying itself, but this is a case of a few profiting at the expense of the rest. I mean, the military towns are booming. The weapons industry is growing. It's, I haven't sat on an airplane in months when I wasn't sitting next to somebody who was working for the military machine, and it looks like the one bright spot in the economy. And yet economists will tell you without dispute that those same dollars would buy more jobs and better jobs in any other industry than that one. It's, without the negative side effects as well. It's destroying the environment, the physical environment. The single biggest consumer of petroleum is our military. The biggest destroyer of land and water is our military. Environmental groups that continue to be good Americans and not oppose this military machine are selling out the world, literally. It's destroying our civil liberties and our possibilities for representative government in Washington, D.C. During wartime, all can be stripped away, and we now have permanent wartime. It is predictably and treasonously expanding global terrorism each and every year of the global war on terrorism. The blowback is not going to be survivable. We are proliferating nuclear weapons, which is going to take off at an exponential rate. We are not going to survive that. I mean, there are 8 ways in which this will kill us, whether you think some war 3 generations ago was a nice one or not. So,
But does it help an American corporation in the Philippines get business over a French company because we have this military power? Does it have any effect, and if so, for whom, in a positive way? I agree with everything I've heard you say.
Well, look at the cables from WikiLeaks from the so-called State Department, which works for the so-called Defense Department. Much of what our State Department employees do is sell U.S.-made weapons to other countries. Certainly, those weapons makers like selling weapons. Certainly, they are pleased with that. Whether their grandchildren can survive it or not is a different question, and I would argue an important one.
Yeah, but do we sell GM cars, though, more because of that? I'm sorry, I'm done.
Even Thomas Friedman has said that globalization would never work without the Marine Corps.
Yes, Yes, but I don't think it would work even with it. 1, 2, 3. These will be our last 3 questions. I'll try to be brief. Yes, you.
Oh, okay. Well, David, you and I wrangle a lot about this. How do we get, from a writing and organizing perspective, how do we get the people in this country to take moral responsibility to end these wars? And I do have to say, one of the strengths of your book, for people who haven't read it yet, is one of the things we have that's a strength is the morality. The conversation that you had with the Afghan kids this weekend, and what these wars have done in our name to the rest of the world is extremely important to bring out. But people say to me, people are not motivated by morality. They're motivated by their own pocketbook interest. And I find that a very cynical approach. I do think that there's a big problem we have. People have raised this, that you have a system that absolutely can't let the other guy run the Middle East. That's what's going on right now in my book, and all of our demands to this government, Democrat or Republican, to please stop this war are not heard because they must continue this kind of a war in order to run the world. I really feel that's what we're up against. As immoral as it is, as outrageous, how do we communicate that to the rest of the people that are living in this country with us?
Well, I completely agree with you. It's somewhat of a rhetorical question, I think, as well. But I do think that Americans tell pollsters, for what that's worth, that their number 1 concern is surviving this economy, and their number 2 concern is stopping these wars. And I think that increasingly people are making the connection, and we're able to make that argument that there's a financial cost to these wars. But I do not think for a minute that we should be complicit in the false idea that that's the only thing that will motivate people, that people are only motivated by selfish or financial interests. I think that people are hugely motivated by humanitarian and generous concerns, which is why, of course, they sell the wars as humanitarian adventures. So I think you need both types of arguments, and you need people to have a deeper understanding, which is why I'm spending time writing books and raising money to give the books to schools and libraries and counter-recruitment groups. I think that it certainly can't hurt. But beyond having the understanding, I want people to have the moral drive to get in the way of the machine and be willing to make sacrifices and be willing to go to jail and be willing to lose something out of their lives to try to stop this before it goes off a cliff, and to have an attention span that goes beyond, but we just lost an election, or we haven't ended wars this month, to the point of the mindset of the people who got us the right to vote in the first place and ended slavery and everything good that's ever happened, which has come about by people working happily through their lifetime, allowing some future generation to see the victory. And I think Americans can get there. They've done it before.
I haven't read your book, but I intend to. And I'm wondering if you think there's any potential or possible benefit in the idea of having people push for a transformation of the military. In other words, especially at a time now when it's so obvious to so many people across the political spectrum that we have huge problems that are potentially problems with resources and dwindling resources, and also environmental problems. Is there, I can sort of feel myself saying there's risks to this, but maybe there would be some benefit to the idea of having some people push for a transformation of the military to do peaceful work that is also work that would be work that you would have to be trained and have skills. I mean, there were, for example, for Katrina, there was a real need to have people come together and organize a rescue operation and also a medical rescue operation. What if the military were trained to do that? Is it so impossible to think that the military could be transformed into a peace force? I don't know what you want to call it, but, and that, there would be a way to go that way.
I think that I think several answers, including the one that people are shouting out. If you didn't hear the question, it is can the military be transformed into something that works for peace and useful efforts and disaster relief and humanitarian efforts rather than just war? And a number of people have been saying National Guard, and I do think that the campaigns in states to have states say you cannot federalize the National Guard and send it into foreign wars of empire are right on and should continue and should win. I think that we need efforts with the energy that is put into wars on peaceful crusades. I don't think they should be the responsibility of the military. I think that, as people have argued in this country since William James at least, that we should have public service that's non-military, that's peaceful. That at the moment we have a particular crisis over stopping this planet getting too hot. There is absolutely no reason not to put the energy and effort into that goes into killing people. But I don't think it should come under the heading of the so-called Department of Defense. I don't think that having them take up concerns of hurricane relief and tsunami relief and so forth is a risk we can take. I mean, when they wanted to escalate in Vietnam and suddenly there were big floods in Vietnam and they said, oh yeah, we can send in the military for flood relief. It was a godsend for them, but it was death to the Vietnamese. I think allowing the military to have that cover is something that we should not encourage. In fact, we should end it immediately. The military should be for what the military is for, if it has to exist at all, and that is fighting off attacks on our soil. And we should have separately what you're talking about. We certainly could have it. The lines are out the door to join the military because of the economy. Unless we have jobs, we can't stop the wars. And unless we stop the wars, we can't have jobs. But one way we could have jobs if we had a government would be to create separately what you're talking about. I think there was one more. Yeah.
I don't know I'm not sure if this will be a question, but I hope you'll answer it anyway. Partly, a couple of the speakers are really asking, I'm getting for some analysis from you about what is the motivation, and isn't the fact that, I mean, I assume people like Randolph Bourne, are people who you've read, and pacifists like Paul Goodman who are making big analyses of war and the structure of our society. Randolph Bourne said war is the health of the state. I think people are asking for a kind of, some analysis that ties in why we are such a warlike entity and ties it into our, to use this, word, hierarchical society where we know it's very wealthy people like to get very poor people, way down on the, on the class totem pole to fight for them and to kill other people for them. And when we're not, lobbing money into the military system, we're building prisons. So, we're the state is, the state has a monopoly of violence, and our economic system, the fact that we colonize every inch of space, every inch of time, seems to have to do with why we're such a war-making society. Does that interest you at all? I mean, do you engage with that kind of question? I mean, I appreciate that you say you don't want to find one cause, and things are multiply caused, and I appreciate what you seem to be doing, but do any of these questions interest you?
So, a number of good, excellent points, all of which I expand on in this book, and all of which I agree with. And if you missed any of them, it is absolutely the case that one of the economic motives for war is that patriotic fervor and war-making redirects energies against other nations rather than against the wealthy who are ripping people off in our own nation. I am delighted that you're so dissatisfied. I think we all need to be very dissatisfied. But I certainly agree 100% with everything that you've said. I think everything you've said is fundamentally important to fixing our country, and I've expanded on it at some length in this book, which includes a lengthy chapter that looks at the many motivations that keep us in wars, both rational and irrational motivations, including all of the ones that you touched on. I hope that's a little bit helpful.
One last one.
We can, if you have other questions, you can ask them, directly of David, who will gladly talk to you privately. This is a great event. I'm thrilled that so many people showed up to hear you. Next month, I guess that's February 1st, right? So the first Tuesday. Ed Morgan is coming to talk about his new book, What Really Happened in the 60s, as a historian. And it is a fabulous analysis of what actually did happen to a decade that's become almost a kind of laugh line, It's been grotesquely caricatured and misunderstood. He talks about that, but he also talks about the actual developments that put it, sort of permanently in the past. So I hope to see you there, and we'll be here every first Tuesday every month. Thank you all for coming, and thanks a million, David.